Hello and welcome to Malcolm Show episode 10. Okay, so today's episode I've been going through my notes and I've realized there's a bunch of stuff that I want to cover in each episode, and at the same time I've realized that the amount of stuff I want to cover in each episode from my notes exceeds the amount of time I can really effectively put into each episode. So I think what I'm going to do going forward is, instead of having notes specific to each episode, the way I write them down is the episode notes I have aren't going to be entirely, what's the word, reflective of the episodes that I release. So, for instance, the way I write a lot of them down is in my phone. I have like episode 8, episode 9, episode 10, saying, oh, these notes for this episode, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized when I was recording, like, I've still got notes about, I had notes from episode 9, which I released for episode 8, which technically makes it the other way around, not the point, where I haven't even started the stuff I wanted to get into with episode 8. There's stuff about episode 10 which I find really fascinating. So I'm going to try and finish off the stuff chronologically because I feel that's going to make the most sense. And I also feel it needs a slight more of a free form because I feel once I started making the notes, I started trying to force it onto a script. And scripting's fun, however, I think it also sometimes stifles the creative nature of it. So with the whole chronological order thing, I've noticed that a lot of the time, how I feel about what I call the Matrix is basically, okay. Here's now, there are a few celebs who refer to the Matrix as more of a real thing than just a concept, and honestly, I agree with it. One of the big things I'm trying to do with this podcast is refer to it in ways that are actually understandable, and something I'm wanting to do with this podcast is make more written notes whilst I'm producing because I'm testing a theory. So basically, the idea I find is that the Matrix is real. It's not just a film, it's the idea of all this technology we have interacts with each other and overlaps with everything. So basically, the more that we understand how that works and how it all interacts with each other, the better it makes sense. So a lot of the time, I'm trying to explain to myself what I feel is the Matrix. And I don't want to use that as like a cliche buzz term. It's more the fact that I haven't got a better term to describe it yet. And frankly, as much as there's the whole like red pill, blue pill crowd that talk about the Matrix, I mean, I've had my own really weird experiences where there were choices between red and blue, and that's a whole thing. Like the experience I described, the most real thing I've ever experienced was once, what year was it? 2019 maybe? Yeah, 2019, late winter, early spring. I was back before I'd gotten clean and I was smoking cannabis. And I remember coming in from the night and I'd already had, I think, at least one roll, maybe two, from that bag that I'd bought. So I had no reason to suspect anything other than it's just weed. I just got it from my usual guy, usual strain, nothing at the blue, no massive changes or anything like that. So I go out, I did my usual walk around the block because it timed out. It's pretty much as soon as I'd finished the smoke, I was back at the house. Great, okay, it's pretty much bedtime. I'll go for my stretch, brush my teeth, all that jazz, be ready. No worries. I had absolutely no reason to think otherwise. I already smoked from this bag before. So what happened? I remember I had somebody staying over that night, and well, they were already tired and went to bed. So, all right, cool. I'm just gonna do my stuff. We're doing in a minute. And I'm in the living room. I'm doing like a mobility workout to stop myself getting injured. And then all of a sudden, I kind of, boom, out of what I understood to be perceivable reality into something that, to this day, I don't know what it was. You could have told me I died and that was the reloading screen, and I'd believe you. I know there's a lot of very powerful hallucinogenics out there that can do these sort of things. However, like I said, I'd already rolled at least once, if not twice, from that bag. So if the bag was laced, then I mean, I was just picking bits and bobs out. It wasn't like, grinding the whole thing together. It's not like it's going to be one specific part of it that caused it. Because I remember smoking the rest of that bag over the next few days and I remember being very, very, very careful because I was like, oh, what's in this stuff? Because I felt physically fine afterwards. It was more just, what the hell's going on, like visually. Because in my head, it's like, it didn't matter which way my head was going, up, down, left, right, forwards, backwards, whatever. I didn't move. And I remember, like, I can still feel my body. I can still feel, like, walking left to right, I can still kind of feel my internal gyroscope. However, visually, it didn't matter which way up my head was, the plane of perception that I was looking at was the exact same. Like if I was looking at this angle, it was completely level. It's completely level here. It's completely level here, as if it was completely level, like on the perfect, say that's the 90-degree angle of a 360 circle. Like it was really baffling, and the whole thing was like basically it just looked like perfect black with a white grid network. But it was, instead of like lines of grid, it was like little dots. Like here, you could tell there was like it was a cube, so you have like 8 dots, and then like to like frame the reference of the cube, and it just kept going on and on, like just forever, never, never, kind of like a perfect connect the dot system. And all of a sudden, I remember it just kind of a red orb of light and a blue orb of light, and this is why it was like really trippy to me. It was like, holy shit, is the Matrix real? Is this actually happening? And I thought, well, I mean, if this is going to happen, how many opportunities are we really going to have to choose the red pill? So, without any other basis other than the film, I thought, well, why not? Let's choose red, see what happens. And yeah, I just remember like my head going back and forth between the two, and this was the only time the entire like level of perception changed at all, because it felt that I could look at the left to the red, I could look at the right to the blue, and that was it. That was all I could, as far as I understand, interact with the environment. So I went with the red one, and then I remember sort of coming back to, and then the next few days were like really weird. Like I understand if that was a hallucinogenic and stuff, there might be like residual effects. However, it didn't. None of the subsequent rolls I had from that bag of weed, which smelt the same, looked the same, everything like that, perfectly ordinary as far as I could tell, and just didn't. None of it made any sense. Why was that a specific roll from that bag? And never precedingly or afterwards from that dealer had anything even mildly similar to that experience. Because it didn't feel like I was high. It didn't feel like I was tripping. It just felt, there's another level to reality. How the hell did I get here? Kind of thing. Just like, what on earth is going on? It's like, am I still alive? Is this Earth? Is this what reality is? Are we actually in a simulation? All of that. And it's, the next few days, it just kind of felt like awakening to this whole idea of watching people be bots. It's like, I don't want to like abuse the idea of the NPC meme. It's just that's kind of how it felt. Like I could see human interaction so much clearer than before. Like beforehand, it just felt like I was in a complete haze, not paying attention to what anybody was doing, to what anybody's interactions were beyond like the people in my direct vicinity. It was incredible how clearly it just. And ever since then, I've been trying to understand it and trying to explain it to myself. And there's so many ways that make sense to me in my head. And it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. And then try to explain it to somebody else, and it comes across kind of crazy. And it's not meant to come across crazy. It's just I didn't know how else better to explain it. And then terms like natural flow and living algorithms and stuff like that seem to be the best way of being able to explain that stuff to other people. And it's one of the reasons I think that behavioral conditioning has become such a fascination for me, because to me, a lot of the time, human behavior now just looks like a series of logic gates. Like, is it A plus Z, A plus B makes C, then okay, well, then we've got D plus E makes F, and right, okay, and you just follow it. And then the more you understand how logic gates work, brain has, plus all the whole logic gates and technology that interacts with, like biological algorithms, digital algorithms, it's, to me, it just eventually kind of seemed like, well, math seems to be the way forward with this. So how can what branch of math is going to make more sense here? So game theory became kind of an obvious thing for me to like, all right, well that makes sense. We can try and understand it in game theory. If everything's a game, then obviously there's a criteria of victory. In the same sense that with this, there must be an up and a down. There must be a right or a wrong, a true or a false, whatever it is trying to understand which polarity was perceivably positive. For instance, it's it's a weird thing as I noticed by listening to music, especially like hip hop music, where there's a whole very simple idea. Like there's a a song by Pusha T. It goes money, pussy, alcohol. It's like, well, those like money is obviously useful in many senses in a modern capitalistic society. Pussy, well, there's the whole status thing attached to having lots of women as well as being able to reproduce. And then there's the alcohol angle of it just makes you feel better and ignores everything else and blah blah blah. It's like, well, and ever since then, it's like before I even clocked onto that song, it just felt like it was the idea of what I describe as natural flow, just when you're not in any specific mindset with it. It just ever since then it feels like I can, depending on what words I use, depends on how I'm being interpreted. And if I speak in a specific manner, I can be, even without even mentioning specific trigger words, it feels like I'm being interpreted as being high or drunk or crazy or confused or whatever. And it's like I've become so much more self-aware, not just of my vocal communications, of my physical, like my body language. All my physical communications have to be so much more in tune, which then, like, so far I've barely even touched my notes for today, apart from streamable reality making life basically a game or a film or the Matrix, as you want to call it. And that whole physical consciousness and self-awareness of it, it's got me to the point where it kind of feels like every time I'm physically moving, I'm communicating something. For example, little things like if my hand's like this, verse like this, verse like that, verse like this. Like, I know that seems absolutely ridiculous. However, when you think about it on some level, we're basically, every body language communication, no matter how small or subtle it is communicating something. It might be a 0.001 difference that as a nuance that you'd have to be a machine or somebody who's 1,000 years old and seen more people than everybody else in existence combined to understand. However, it's still something, and I think the idea of dismissing it as, no, that's not a big deal, it's just, it's willful ignorance. It's ignoring the idea that it's very, very possible that people can actually be, you know, digital. Maybe the entire simulation we live in, maybe the entire world we live in is just a simulation. Maybe everything that we thought was real isn't real. Maybe everything we consider to be a manifestation of a physical reality is really just a digital reality that we didn't understand anywhere near as well as we understand now. And to be honest, I'm kind of convinced of the idea that computers are in charge already. Like, you can't convince me otherwise of that. It's just, I mean, maybe somebody who understands this entire system better than me and how. So, for instance, I understand almost everything other people say is some way, shape, or form metaphorically for something else, unless they're being explicitly specific. Because a lot of the time, people are saying something when really they mean something else, and it just feels so much of the time like you can really reduce. Like, when I don't know, it's almost like it's less of a lie detector and more of a truth detector, because you get to the point where I remember hearing this as a, where did I hear it? It's probably a podcast where I heard it recently, where it was the idea that most doctors don't bother trying to figure out when a patient's lying, they try to figure out when a patient's telling the truth. And that to me was like, oh shit, that makes a lot of sense. And I remember watching a show called A Very Secret Service where, I don't know how fictionalized the whole concept it was, but basically it was about various international secret services from a French perspective, and the Russians had this idea where instead of a lie detector, they had a truth detector. And my own personal observation with this, with the whole like logic things, like once is an occurrence, twice is a pattern, three is a trend, four is a habit, and by the fifth time you probably should have noticed it earlier. Of course, we have some behaviors which are so deeply ingrained which you don't notice until you're on your 10th, 15th, 20th, whatever. The thing is, like, the whole idea of a truth detector, it really makes sense. And I've noticed with men, at least, and I'm wondering if it's like male to male is much easier than male to female, and maybe female to female is much easier than female to male. I mean, it's so much easier for me to clock on to when a guy is being honest with me, and with women, like, I just cannot seem to tell in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. And yet with guys, it's just, I don't know if that's a genetic thing, like it's a Malcolm thing, or if it's a biological thing for the species where males can tell what males are doing and females can tell what females are doing. It's very difficult cross gender. It just absolutely blows my mind that it goes that deeply. It's just incredible, and it's oh so fascinating. So the idea of the truth detector, to me, it's more useful because if you work on a premise, well, if everybody's kind of lying all the time, then to some extent, it's well, we can go into the whole like. I felt like my last video was a bit, my last video and a half was a bit of a blog post. However, sometimes I feel like the blog post stuff kind of helps me provide context for what I'm talking about. And it's like I've noticed that if I work on the basis that most people are lying all the time, the really only thing that you can trust is stuff like ambition and personal, basically self-serving attitude. The thing is, though, is once you understand if everybody's on that self-serving attitude, then the better you understand everybody being on a self-serving attitude, then the easier it is to understand humanity as a whole. And like, I really think that most people don't appreciate the difference. It's like that whole thing with people in power, the higher proportion of them being psychopathic or sociopathic or whatever the term is nowadays. I mean, I think the distinction between psychopath and sociopath is really just a matter of functioning, and that a psychopath is understands people and a sociopath understands society. That would be my personal interpretation of it. I know the DSM is probably going to disagree. The point is, I think the DSM really doesn't understand mental health anywhere near as well as it claims to. I think most mental health conditions are vastly misinterpreted as illnesses rather than just additions of human. It's just humanity being humanity. It's not an illness. It's just some people are that vastly different to you. And I think modern society exacerbates a lot of it by the way we're coerced into this idea of being pressured to be something very, very specific from a young age. I think the idea of community living is very human. I think the extent to which we've developed it nowadays has it's put so much pressure on people to fulfill specific roles that that's what induces what's perceived as mental illness when it's really just a response to stress. Anyway, it's yeah, the whole truth detector thing. If you work on the basis that everybody's lying all the time, yeah, it can be very difficult to establish trust with anybody. However, once you understand that what you can trust is people serving their own self-interest, well, like, okay, well, hang on. If I'm only ever surrounded by people that are trying to improve at something, whether it's like increase the profit margin or learn more stuff or become better at a sport or better at chess, for example, all these things, it makes it much easier to trust the person you're with having honest intention behind the speak. And this thing is like I still hear ulterior motives. Like in my own voice, sometimes I I feel sort of not morally reprehensible for it, just a little bit ethically dubious. Is like if I speak in such a manner where I know the words I'm using are being specifically chosen to elicit a response, am I doing that in a sense of advice and guidance, or is it manipulation? And it's like, well, what's the difference between those two? There's a conversation I was having with myself recently, based on some comments that I'd written online, and then a conversation I was having with a friend. It was like, well, hang on, if flirting is just a precursor to seduction, then what's grooming? Because this is the whole thing I was talking about with natural flow and like physical body language and physical communication being a thing. Because at some extent, once you become so hyper aware of your body language, you start being aware of like, well, hang on, if I brush my hair with this hand in this manner or that hand in that manner, then there's a difference in response to it, and the difference in response might vary from person to person. However, generally, if it's left or right, you understand there's some kind of difference, whether the person interpreting it being by what's closest to them or understanding on a deeper level, there's a left and a right as a language. And to me, it's like, well, what's the difference between seduction and grooming? The whole idea of seducing somebody is to convince them of the idea that you are absolutely perfect to them. You're the most beautiful thing in the world. They're the most beautiful thing in the world to you. It's like I understand that grooming has much more insidious connotations. The idea of grooming generally is sort of the idea of somebody taking advantage of somebody else in a more vulnerable state than themselves. What I'm trying to say though is like with seduction, the whole idea is to put yourself in a position where the other person is kind of putty in your hands and that consent is generated. Like, I really don't think, I think the difference between guidance manipulation and seduction and grooming really is just one of perspective. And it's really like, I understand this is very delicate, sensitive territory to be talking about, and I'm trying to do my best not to present myself as something I'm not. It's more that I don't know. Maybe at some level I'm just understanding it in ways that I haven't before, and I need to think it out loud to get it off my head. it's just what I'm finding strange is that these sort of conversations that I'm having with the computer, there are very few people I can have these conversations with, and I don't think it's a matter of intelligence because I haven't struggled to find people intelligent enough to have these kind of conversations with. It's people willing to engage in difficult topics of conversation and actually communicate about stuff that is complicated and uncomfortable because there is so much stuff in the world which, you know, how do I phrase this? Unpleasant. Things like, it's like I've described before that living algorithms that have essentially become into like, you can think of it as like human trafficking. If you once you understand how deeply a living algorithm functions, you can understand as a principle it's a human trafficking tool. So a living algorithm, let's say with enough time that people get programmed to behave as an algorithm does, which is kind of, it makes sense, enough time spent around, it's like you become a product of 5 people you spend the most time around. Well, by that logic, we could also argue you become a product of the, people, of the algorithms you spend the most time around. So I'm going to make a note of that. Product of 5. That would help if I spelt that word correctly. Yep. It's more of a messy handwriting than a misspelling. 5. So if you become a product of the 5 people or algorithms you spend the most, you're around the most, you're most exposed to maybe, then let's say that's your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, and your boss, right? Well, then you're going to become an amalgamation of your father, your mother, your brother, your sister, and your boss. So if we put that into context of an algorithm, let's say, if we've got some brand names here, let's say the 5 biggest algorithms most people are exposed to in some way, shape, or form are probably from Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Android, and Apple. Which then you could argue, well, if those 5 algorithms are such a prevalent presence in the modern world, then basically humans are going to start behaving in similar ways to the algorithms they have. So whether that be Alphabet's way of getting you to look at more adverts or click more YouTube links or scroll through their search engines more, or it's Meta getting you to spend more time on social media, or it's Amazon trying to convince you to buy this, that, and the other, or it's how Apple, Android and Apple's inbuilt algorithms work alongside apps. I won't pretend to understand Android and Apple technology further than I do. I get the general concept of how Amazon, Alphabet, Amazon, and Meta would work simply because I feel they're not complicated concepts. I think smartphones are deliberately designed to keep people on the smartphones as much as possible. You can say it's the apps themselves. I think the smartphones work in a similar fashion. I think you'd be naive to believe that there isn't some sort of software, there isn't some component to the software which is designed to improve functionality. Well, hang on, if I can do this with my phone, I'll do it with my phone. It's like, well, why would I want to write that down when I could type it on my phone? It's just, if you were the person responsible for generating that business, you'd probably have similar ideas. And I think a lot of people like to relate themselves to positive members of society rather than realize simply by being human, you are all the good and all the bad simultaneously. I am as much a representative of Genghis Khan, Hitler, Mao, and Stalin as I am of Barack Obama, Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and Nelson Mandela. And these are names I'm picking off the top of my head. For whatever reason, I don't know. Those are the 8 names that come to mind first. It might be a result of algorithmic conditioning. It might be a result of biological algorithm conditioning. It might be a result of my own personal reading. It might just be, at this specific moment in time, those are the people I relate to most, for whatever reason. And it's so easy to dismiss that as, it's coincidence, or it's random. It's like, no, it bloody well isn't, okay? It just isn't. There's no such thing as random. Ask any law enforcement agent who's been working more than a decade. Coincidence and random just don't exist. They are excuses for people to explain away things that they don't understand. And the vast majority of things that people attribute to being coincidence or random are just mathematics that you can't correctly equate into linguistic form. That's it. Whether you like the reason for it happening or not, it's ridiculous. Everything happens for a reason, okay? I know there's the whole argument from Stephen Fry. Well, if God's real and everything happens for a reason, why does cancer and insects burrow into the eyes of children? I don't know why. I'm just saying there's a reason for it. Okay? Maybe those insects bury into the eyes of children because it's the only environment by which those larvae will survive. Why is it the only environment those larvae survive in? I don't know. I'm not a I'm not an insect biologist, and it's beyond my responsibility to have to explain that right now. The point stands is, if everything does happen for a reason, then bad things have to happen for a reason, not just good things. If everything happens for a reason, then, well, if bad things and good things exist in the world, then bad things have to happen for some reason. Maybe some people are bad. Maybe it's a manifestation of karma. Maybe the animal kingdom doesn't have to be this morally upstanding, beautiful representation that humanity wants to present itself as. Maybe humankind isn't as morally superior as it likes to think it is, and it's just certain individuals have a higher moral upstanding because they've been afforded the opportunities. It's far too broad a spectrum to go into yes and no for an entire species. That you can't. Well, the thing is, I'm quite a big fan of binary differentiation. You can't actually say that the human species in general, maybe we're just not as morally upstanding as we like to believe we are. We're just the most morally upstanding on this planet because what we're comparing ourselves to are animals and bacteria and plants. Who's to say we're more morally upstanding? Who's to say like a human being that goes out hunting is more morally upstanding than the tiger that hunts for its dinner? And it's like, I'm not trying to be anti-hunting. At the end of the day, I'm very much a freedom of choice kind of person. I don't want to get myself off topic. It's, let's say you have a rifle, you go into the woods, you see a deer, you put a bullet in its head, you take it home, you cure it, you eat it. Grand, well done. From a human perspective, you can argue that disrupts the ecosystem far less than than building a farm and looking after all the cows and this, that, and the other. And on the other hand, you say, well, the cow's killed anyway, we might as well eat it. It's like, yeah, well, maybe the hunter doesn't want to support that system of rearing livestock in unnatural conditions. So then, is the hunter, from that perspective, are they doing a morally upstanding thing? And then the same instance is, well, yeah, the hunter has access to all these other sources of food from maybe the local butchers or the supermarket or whatever. And it's, the tiger doesn't really have the option to, well, as far as I'm aware, tigers don't have wallets in the same understanding that a human has a wallet. Maybe tigers have their own economy and ecosystem. That's another topic I want to get into later on, is the idea of how ecology and economy are actually really similar, and that you could argue that different species of the animal kingdom function like different denominations of currency rising to the top. For instance, the tiger is the most dominant currency in a specific ecosystem, like a lion is the most dominant currency in a different ecosystem, like a jaguar or a leopard or a panther, which I think are all the same thing, are all, or is it jaguar and panther the same thing? Not the point. In their various economies are all dominant currencies, they're dominant species. Like a dominant hierarchy isn't that different in principle from economic power. So say for instance, in a globalized system, we don't have any species that are globally dominant except for humans. You could argue that humans in the context of Earth's ecosystem are the dominant currency simply because wherever humans have gone, we've risen to the top. We just have. That doesn't mean we're the most dominant thing galactically. It doesn't mean we're the most dominant thing universally. It means in this specific ecosystem, in this local ecosystem, we are the dominant species, which is great. That's fine. More importantly, though, is thinking of the idea of, I really just, when I get off script, on I go. Okay. Have myself a sip of water, and we'll continue. Yeah, I said sip and then had about half my glass. More dehydrated than I thought it was. Anyway, the point I was making about ecosystems and people being like currency is like, well, ultimately at some level we are all kind of reducible to numbers. It's like the whole idea of like psychology and sociology are far more interlinked than people want to accept, and sociology is really just a higher reflection of psychology. And since psychology has so many biological components to it, it's very easy to understand that sociology has many biological components to it. And once you accept that both of these fields are very explainable by. Oh, I was a bit of an idiot there, wasn't I? I should have cheered the Queens instead of getting off topic and trying to move the rook. Anyway, it'll be fine. I'll recover this. Yeah, if you understand that the psychology and sociology aspects of humanity are kind of the same thing, then it becomes easier to understand that the whole biological components can be reduced in some way, shape, or form to chemistry. And when they can be reduced to chemistry, they're also then further explainable by reducing them to physics. And physics is just maths. And once you understand that what maths is, then you understand that maths is just a language. And branches of mathematics, such as economics, start explaining more and more how the entire universe works. I think I'm just clocking onto something in my own head of like a personal development thing. I think what it is I'm tired of people not accepting the idea that they're not special. Nobody's as special as they like to think they are. And I really think it's a problem of humanistic hubris. I think far too many members of humanity believe themselves to be special and unique, and like you're just not. Okay, it's like what's the best way to phrase this? It doesn't matter if you're the most powerful man in the world, the richest man in the world, or anything like that. You're just not that special. You're just another human being. Okay, and that's fine. That's okay. And I think that's one of the whole principles of maintaining your ego and stuff. Is like you can have £100 in your bank account, you can have £100 million in your bank account, you can have £100 billion in your bank account. It doesn't make you a better human being. It just means you have access to stuff that other people don't. In the same way, the person with less money is going to have access to stuff that other people don't. They're going to have access to resources that. Oh my Jesus Christ! Well, I am distracted in some way, shape, or form. Um, I think it's because I'm talking so much rather than. This is what I find interesting is that when I really get onto topic and I'm not super paying attention to what I'm doing in front of me, definitely recoverable though. Part of my ego wants to win the game rather than just finish off my conversational point. However, at the same time, I feel my conversational point kind of matters. So let's trade that rook off and see if we can take down a queen with a knight and a bishop, because that would be kind of fun. Let's go there. I'm really enjoying this whole conversation. I think part of it is because I haven't been able to vent this stuff in a while. I haven't been able to get it out of my head. And because I haven't been able to get it out of my head, what's the way to say it? I don't know, it builds up and eventually pressure builds and you're like, oh, hang on, no, I want to talk about this stuff. I'm not going to be censored about this stuff. I'm not going to let somebody tell me I can't talk about this stuff. I'm going to talk about whatever the hell I damn well want to talk about. And you could argue in some sense, like if you take, before I veer too far from the ecology economy thing, it's if we understand that all of society has their preferences about what does get spoken about and doesn't get spoken about, you can argue that there's linguistic economics at hand of these conversational topics are worth more to the public domain. So if you talk about them, you're going to score more points, as it were, or make more money. Because money, you think about it, the more money you make, you're just scoring more points in a game of the world. So that's unusual. It was the idea I was taking with like the whole levels of organization across. How do I phrase this? Yeah, it's the various levels of organization. Because when you think about levels of organization in that manner, then you've got socioeconomics, you'll have psychoeconomics. If you have socioeconomics and psychoeconomics, then to some degree you're going to have bioeconomics. If you have bioeconomics, then maybe this is why I need to get off script a little more, because then I actually start talking about stuff that's delves into new territory rather than rehashing old territory. Because then if bioeconomics are a thing, then chemical economics inferably will become a thing, right? And if chemical economics are an understandable thing, then the economics of physics, technically, that exists. And we already know that economics is a branch of mathematics. So if economics is a branch of mathematics, and we go the other way along this, before we get into like linguistics, semiotics, then, excuse me, pardon me. If economics is already an existing branch of mathematics, then there must be ways of physics can relate to the mathematical form and produce experiments which prove the idea. I mean, you can argue that's what a free market is and that's how business works. At the same time, once we understand that that's how business works, then we understand business works. How do I phrase this? We could just, yep. When that's how we feel business works, then that's how we understand the world to work. And if that's how we understand the world to work, then we're understanding concepts of physics in a manner that's, when it's no longer simply numerically expressible, then it starts having to, this is where it's the bridge between physics, maths and linguistics, is it almost has to become linguistically expressible. When it's linguistically expressible, then it's kind of quantifiable as words, which, well, that's just what it is. There's like, once it's understandable as words, then it's beyond being numbers. Because once you put it into words, it's, if I tell you 1 plus 1 equals 2, you'll agree, because we've all agreed, in this planet at the very least, that 1 plus 1 equals 2. If I tell you that A plus A equals B, well, that's where we start to disagree, because then what does A represent? We've all agreed that 1 represents, for example, a singular pen, and then a second exact, not exact copy, there's different levels of ink in them. However, 1 plus 1 makes 2. However, if A plus A, well, then hang on, we could say that this is a capital A, because capitalized letters are bigger, that's the only reason I'm saying that, and it's got more ink in it. So the capitalized letter and the lowercase letter, it's still an A and an A. Are they still going to make a B or a 2, or is it going to be an A to the power of something, or whatever? The point I'm making is our understanding of mathematics is kind of objective, which is really useful in many ways, because then we only ever use the numbers and ways to explain stuff that is very, very simply mathematical. It's not biased in any cultural sense or political sense or religious sense or anything like that. Numbers are so purely objective. That's one of the reasons I think that capitalism has become one of the dominant ideologies across the planet, because it doesn't worry about offending people, because it's just business, it's not personal, it's just good business. The thing is, though, part of being good at business is understanding how to communicate with people in various ways, yeah? So a big part of being good at business is understanding relationships, and understanding that relationships are how a business relationship is how you develop more business. So then ultimately you start looking at people as units of business, which I don't really know how else to explain it. Unit is business, you know what I mean though. And to me it's the whole notion of, once you start putting units of business into linguistic terms, regardless of what language it is, it could be English, it could be French, it could be German, it could be Hindi, it's hope that their understanding of the language is that of a native speaker. Two, I have to hope that the words I'm using are immediately understandable. And it's the whole idea, it's like that KISS principle of keep it simple, stupid. It's like, you can use, 73 words that have all got 4 or 5 syllables and deliver an exquisitely precise point that by a native fluent speaker of, for example, my mother tongue, is going to completely understand every single word of it, and it'll be perfect. You don't have to worry about misunderstanding. And at the same time, you're going to have somebody who, let's say, for example, their parents moved to this language, weren't native speakers when they arrived. However, the kid has been risen as a native speaker in this country. Their understanding of the language is different from someone whose family's been here for several generations. So then the words you're choosing to communicate to them, pardon, are different. And it's not necessarily good, it's not necessarily bad, it's just different. And it's a tricky thing because I feel I'm veering ever so slightly closer and closer to a potentially offensive way of explaining what I don't mean to be offensive when I'm saying. It's more that there are several instances of communication which can be misconstrued as offensive when they're not meant to be. Oh, baby, that was beautiful. And the tricky thing is that's the linguist economy. That's economics and linguistics overlapping. Is if we all agree from an economical perspective, there are specific words which are less offensive or more specific or anything like that, then eventually everybody in the entire world is going to speak in the exact same manner, and the cultural differences which make humanity what it is are going to be different, are going to be reduced to the point they're just not going to exist anymore, and culture will become what is profitable. And if culture is only purely what is good for business, then our entire species is just going to become a product of business. And if our entire species becomes a product of business, then does that, if we are not the highest functioning, yep, I know. So if our species is not the highest functioning species in the universe, then we very quickly understand that maybe business was the way all along, and it's actually very objective. It removes subjective feelings from the matter, and if everybody's feelings are removed from matter, then nobody's feelings are ranked higher than anybody else's. It's just a matter of profit. That's that's the cold logic to it. That's the thing. Is like I've said this before. I believe that I've probably written it in. It's not this book. It's a different one, which I'm not going to go and find right now. I'll try and find it for a future podcast. I say try it. Maybe I should because I wrote it down in a specific way when I thought out of it. Basically, the idea was that survivalism then becomes thrivism as a species becomes more dominant in its local economy, ecosystem. In the same way as like a business becomes more dominant in its local economy. And then once that survivalism becomes thrivism, that thrivism then becomes closer to what I would describe as colonialism. Because then, all right, well, we're dominant in this local ecosystem and this local economy. Well, let's expand a bit further. So let's say, for example, humans, as far as we all understand, started in Africa. So let's say, all right, well, humans are dominant in all of Africa now. It's not because back then there wasn't really country borders, and the understanding of a continent doesn't really exist. However, the bridge between Africa and Western Asia, I think it's Saudi Arabia is the country for the border there. It might not be. I think it's you got Egypt, you got Saudi Arabia. I think you'd have Palestine. I want to say Libya. Not the point. That there's a jet of water in between Saudi Arabia and Africa, and there's a strip of land that connects them to there. Anybody who's got a map in front of them can look at this for themselves and understand it. The point is, if that's the only land, the strip of land that takes you out of what we'd modernly understand as Africa, then that's going to be the expansion of that species. Let's say, for example, in the same way, let's say the business is in the center of the map, and the closest. Well, hang on, there's somewhere we can set a business over there. There's customers over there. In the same way, a species that wants to develop, well, hang on, there's food over there. There's materials for shelter over there. That's a hospitable environment. We can keep going that way. Then eventually, that idea of survivalism that becomes thrivism then becomes colonialism. You're colonizing new areas in the same way that a business takes over. I mean, let's say, for example, I start a business in this town, and then, it's going really, really well. I'm getting loads of customers, so many customers. I actually need to take on some employees. All right, now I've got some employees, got more customers. Oh, wow, we're still doing well. We're still expanding. All right, well, maybe we need to open another office. Maybe we actually, instead of another office, we'll make this office bigger, and everybody comes in. Oh, wow, hang on. This business is going so well that we could actually go outside of this local area. So instead of this town, there's the next town over. So it's just another office and the next town over, and you get the idea. Is over and over in time, eventually, every business kind of wants to. I mean, there's the whole idea of, well, we've got enough for ourselves, look after ourselves. It becomes that balance of, what was the phrase I heard? It was from Sam Altman, I think, something to do with OpenAI, ChatGPT. He was on Lex Friedman, and it might be Sam Altman. Very clever programmer, and he had this idea about capped profit capitalism, where like once you hit a certain number, you don't make any more profit, or any excess profit goes to charity, or things like that. And like I get that in some sense. However, it's from an ethical perspective, I think it redistributes well. It has the potential to redistribute wealth in a way that's very egalitarian, and I like that. I like the idea of the egalitarian society from a moral perspective. However, if I think about it from the perspective of somebody who wants to win, which I think, as George Hott said, is kind of the meaning of life, and I kind of agree with him on that. It's if you're accepting a loss, why are you accepting a loss? Is it for some sort of moral reason? Is it an ethical reason? Is it because of your principles, your values? Is it simply because you feel bad for the other person? Or maybe is it, well, if I take a small loss here, they get a massive win and then we can both win in the future? That I can understand. It's like a minor setback from major comeback. Shout out Kendrick Lamar. And is that dedication, Nipsey Hussle? It might be dedication. The point's that there's a song by Kendrick Lamar, by Nipsey Hussle with Kendrick Lamar called Dedication, which is very good. If you've not heard it, go listen to it. And yeah, the colonialism is kind of the natural evolution of thrivism, and then from colonialism, it's becomes capitalism because then instead of it being like, and the first example that's coming to mind was the British Empire taking over India, I think, because I was mentioning languages earlier. And then you've also got like, there's the French global empire, and then there's like the Belgians went into technically owned Congo for the late 19th century. King Leopold II, nasty piece of work. And then from his perspective, he was probably the good guy. So it's exactly what I'm saying with the humans. We're simultaneously the good and the bad on one. And then, so survivalism becomes thrivism, becomes colonialism, becomes capitalism. It's the same thing. And then you could argue that capped profit business models are in the same way, like, and this is me thinking in a new era, I haven't thought about this one before, is, well, let's take the tiger, for example, as an example of a capped profit business. The tiger isn't trying to reproduce 100 tigers every time it gets a female tiger pregnant. The tigers are just, yeah, like there's a female tiger, she's in heat, it will reproduce. And the thing is, there'll be some kind of natural cycle that regulates how often tiger, I mean, that's was menstrual. It might not be technically known as a menstrual cycle with tigers. However, if I use that terminology, I'm sure you'll understand what I mean. It's ovulation cycle, that one. Although I guess they're kind of the same thing. Yeah, menstrual cycle and ovulation cycle, I think, are the same thing from a different perspective because menstrual's not the point. There'll be a natural system and cycle by which tigers find other tigers to make more tigers. And yet, as much as tigers are clearly an apex predator, and in most environments they are completely obliterating all of their competition, at the same note, tigers haven't become the only land-based predator, have they? In the same way that in the seas, orcas technically outrank great white sharks. They do. Great white sharks get killed by orcas. It's something I learned recently, which is quite cool. And we still, I don't think there's a massive shortage of tigers or of orcas. However, their threat to tigers' natural environment is humans. Otherwise, they're fine. And it's like, well, does that mean that humans are... What's a really good comparison? Because I was going to say Microsoft because, well, yeah, I suppose operating system wise, Microsoft is kind of up there. Even as much as Apple is big, Microsoft is still kind of king in the operating software. So, yeah, so let's say the operating software perspective is like, if humans are Microsoft, let's say all the other apex predators are various Apple products, whether they're your orcas, your tigers, your lions, your polar bears, whatever. It's and the thing is, that's because of technology coming on. So is that... Sorry, I'm in new territory. This is one of the reasons why when I'm ranking level of order for disciplines, if you've got like, if we start biology, chemistry, physics, maths, linguistics, because maths is a language, so you have to understand, you can look at all the numbers and make sense of it all, you still have to put it into an understandable expression. So once you write that expression for other people to understand, it's like, oh, hang on, yeah, he makes sense. It's like in the same way, like, if I use 13 letters of the 26 letter Roman alphabet to make a new word, it has to be understandable to other people, and I have to apply context for it and a definition, all this. And then semiotics, I personally rank above linguistics, because semiotics is just linguistics with more abstract concepts. And then I think above that, personally, is cartography, because cartography is just exploration in maps. You're exploring symbols, you're exploring language, you're exploring math, you're exploring physics, chemistry, biology, sociology, psychology. You're just exploring it all to make a map that you understand, and then you compare it to other people's maps and see if they understand, and then we all come together, cartography conference, which, might just be a classroom or a place of business or with your training partners in the gym or anything like that. If from a jiu-jitsu example, let's say I'm a big fan of the omoplata move because I find it really useful. I find it's an expression of technical ability rather than brute force. If I find it's going to be a stretch to call myself an omoplata specialist. Omoplata specialist, not an omoplata expert. We'll go with that terminology. And so if I find an armbar specialist, a triangle specialist, they've probably done so many different ways for arm bars, and somebody's found so many different ways for triangles. If the three of us then spend, let's say, 10 hours in an open mat, we take, an hour each for the first 9 hours going through. All right, we'll do some arm bars, then we'll do some omoplatas, then we'll do some triangles. And the next one, okay, well, how does the arm bar relate to all the omoplatas? How does the triangle relate to omoplatas? And then for the second 3 hours, we'll go like, all right, so how does the omoplata go through the arm bars and the triangle? And then so on, how does the triangle go through the arm bars and omoplatas? And in that last hour, we find, well, what's the most efficient manner that, let's say, week one of it, we go through the arm bars, just as an alphabetical example. All right, what's the best way for an arm bar to be found from an omoplata and triangle? And consequently, in the second week, what's the best way for an omoplata to be found from an arm bar and triangle, and so on. And then third week, it's how to find a triangle choke from an arm bar and omoplata. It's eventually you're consolidating all that information until you get better and better and better and better, and you're finding the relevant mapping networks for it. So, for example, I map out the omoplatas because it took my fancy. So shout out to training partner Zach, who taught me the omoplata suite very early on in my jiu-jitsu career, and I just thought it was really cool because it made me feel like an actual martial artist instead of just flopping around on top of somebody trying to get some sort of pin or submission. And then I kind of built my game upon that in the same way that my head coach, Dominic Deviech, is a really, really skillful like the amount of ways he knows how to armbar and find arm bars and connect them all. And that's just from what I've seen of him in his lessons and what he's taught me personally. There will be so many other ways that I'm sure he's able to do it that I just either have missed the nuance of or haven't caught on to yet. And so one of my training partners, Connor Mortimer, he's amazing with triangles. It's like when other people describe his game, they reference his triangle stuff. So if the three of us got together and discussed arm bars, omoplatas, and triangles, then the three of us are going to find really good ways to map out the connections between those three. In the same way that if we've got, let's say, three tribes of the same species, if they come together in, let's say, there's a seaside component, a snowy mountain component, and a forest component. So you've got one who are used to quite warm weather. Like when I say seaside, I'm saying like Mediterranean. Let's say somebody from like a Mediterranean biome, somebody from the Himalaya biome, and then somebody from central Ohio. I don't know what's rainforest biome. No, it's kind of, it's not the middle. It's the ground I was looking for. Feck it. We'll go with. I don't want to say Amazon rainforest. It sounds like I'm shilling already. Let's go with the Ohio forest. What really big forests? Okay, and so let's say you've got someone from the Mediterranean, you've got someone from the Himalayas. They're both humans. They both understand how to get food, how to build shelters, and everything like that. Okay, so they'll cross-reference with each other, and then you have somebody from. Oh, let's just go with the Bavarian forest. I know Bavarian forest. I understand it well. I understand it's two European and one Asian. It makes sense in my head, and it's what I understand so far. So then you've got people who understand how to make boats really well because they're by the seaside. You've got people who understand how to process lumber really well because they're by the forest, and you've got people who understand really well how to cold proof everything. The people by the seaside may never have had to learn how to cold proof. However, it doesn't mean it's not a useful skill for them if they want to expand their civilization anywhere. And it's the concept of like, it's something I was saying before to myself about like different cultures evolve because of different biomes. I think part of, like every country has its own kind of culture. Every continent will have its own kind of culture that's different to each country's culture, which is different to each major region's culture, which is different to every major city. Or like, let's say for example, we're in London, The culture in Kensington is very different to the culture in Islington. The culture in Islington and Kensington is going to be different to that of Croydon. It's going to be different to that of Shoreditch. Like all these parts of London, they're still all London though. And it's like I remember I was chatting to somebody at work the other day about this. It was a customer, and we were chatting football teams. So I'm Scottish, so football wise, I was raised with a Rangers household. So even though I'm not a big football fan, I still support Rangers. There's a bit of loyalty thing. And he's saying, oh, because we're from this local town, this other local team is our neighbours. However, when England are playing, we all support England. And it's that same idea of like, well, for all a human species, it doesn't really matter if we grew up by the seaside, in a forest, or on the mountains. Like, we're still all humans. Like, we can overcome those differences. And part of me is like feeling a bit hippy dippy to say that sort of thing. And then, like, well, if you want to be profitable about it, really? I, I I looked at that and I saw the bishop and thought, no, that'll be fine. I don't need to do that whatsoever. And I thought I had a like second rook. I would have been a really nice checkmate as well. Lovely little pawn, which you missed. Anyway, is it that one again? It's that one again. I even moved that pawn. There's a yeah. I think there's most cultural differences really boil down to ecological, and then that's why I think the ecological overlaps with the socioeconomic side of stuff because once you understand how ecology makes different people do different things, you then understand how their local economies grow as a result of that. So, for instance, the seaside economy is going to be based on the ecology of there being about much more fish than the forest or on the side of a mountain. So that's part of how their economy builds. And so, like all around the Mediterranean, like fish is a really large part of their diet. In the same way, like the local um, climate is really conducive to growing olives, and olives are delicious. Are also probably kind of a substantial part of the economy around the Mediterranean, whether it be through olives or olive oil or olive spreads or olive oil products. It's just part of how that works. In the same way, like around Bavaria, I know beer's a really big thing in Germany. I don't know enough about Bavarian forest specifically to know what other products are massive in their economy. However, there will be things that are so specific to the Bavarian economy because of their ecology. I really hope I'm using the word ecology correctly here. For the context, I think everybody will understand that it creates products which are known specifically as Bavarian, and then globally, people will want Bavarian products. And this is the things like when you reduce everything down to numbers, does it then just become instead of Bavarian beer, is it then beer 0.123456 instead of Italian fishing or Greek fishing or Palestinian fishing or Egyptian fishing? Is it then just fishing port 1, fishing port 2, fishing port 3, and fishing port 4? Like, what really happens at that point? Is it and it's like it's the sensitivity of it. It's like, do you really want to reduce the entire human species to numbers? And it's like, well, maybe reducing everything to numbers actually is what brings about peace. It might. This is a level of futurism I've never been to before, so my mind is ahead of my body. Oh god, I feel like such a prick saying that. Anyway, it's. I hope it makes sense. What I'm trying to explain in my head is that, like, on one hand, the idea of reducing everything to numbers simplifies it to such an extent that you remove all emotions from the matter, and then emotions. Well, I've said this before. Emotions are just chemicals, and because emotions are just chemicals, that means everything about emotions is simply a chemical that we're interpreting. It's just biology reduced to chemistry, and once you understand there's a chemical notation for it all, it's just that is what it is. It's not necessarily the most. The thing is, though, right? I find sorry, this is something I'm testing. The whole when I was talking about the whole world being like the matrix and system. I find like it's just trying to explain earlier on without sounding mad. It's when I drink water, I feel like my mind thinks differently to when I've just had a drink of my protein shake. And I've also, for the sake of today's episode, although I haven't actually sipped it yet, I've got a sip of Iron Brew going on, even though I haven't touched it. And it feels like my mind works in a hierarchy. All right, the healthy. If I'm thirsty, have some water. If I really want to have some protein shake, have a sip of water, then have protein shake. If I really want some Iron Brew, all right, okay, have I had some water, had some protein shake, or I've had all of those and still want some Iron Brew? All right, there's a strong argument for Iron Brew, and I think with all that, like, there's the whole addiction perspective of it, and it's the whole flow perspective. The point I'm trying to make is that the numerical side of everything, it's like with chess. Like, I could argue on a mathematical basis, even like Alpha Zero and Stockfish have recognized that stuff like the Spanish opening and the Sicilian defense are both really strong. Just mathematically, just make sense. So if you're ever playing against those machines, they're not going to start opening with like. And I'm trying to avoid any accidental xenophobia when I say this. The Polish opening is not, in a chess context only, is not the strongest opening. In the same way that like the modern defense probably isn't the strongest defense if you're in a, the world championship final. If you're playing against friends, you're just enjoying chess, then yeah, sure, why not? It's absolutely fine. And the same with like, let's say for example, a world champion. Let's say for example, Magnus Carlsen comes from my local town for whatever reason, goes to one of the local pubs where I know they have chess sets and challenges everybody in there. He might specifically only ever open with a4 or knight a3 simply because he knows that he's the chess world champion playing against local people who likely haven't got ratings much into the four figures. Forget being close to the 2000s. I mean, a 2000 rated player to Magnus Carlsen is a warm up at best. A triple digit, it's just not a challenge in any way, shape, or form. It's not going to be. In the same way that, like, I'm a blue belt in jiu jitsu. If I go against Hodger Gracie or Gordon Ryan or, I mean, pick a black belt, I'm getting my ass kicked. No matter how kindly they roll with me and how gently and, patiently they roll with me, the likelihood of me having the initiative in it is incredibly slim. I'm not trying to do myself down or do myself down. They're just better than me, and it's that perspective. I think that with linguistics, it's like I think because linguistics has developed cultural superiority in some sense because of the result of various countries having done certain stuff first. That dang it. For instance, this is meant to be. This is not meant to be a political comment. This is just an observation. It's not. I get really frustrated when anybody mentions vaguely political stuff because nowadays it just feels like clickbait. I also have a whole thing about how there's real life clickbait from identity politics, which if I start talking about it now, I'll get off topic. I'm going to make a note about that here though. I also have a thing about how analog writing is the OG coding. And if we are living in a simulation, then technically everything I've written in analog is coding my simulation, which, as a concept, I think is just fun to talk about. And if it's real, then it's actually motivated me to get really good at writing, become really conscious of, hang on, if everything I'm writing is manifesting something relevant, I understand I'm getting myself off topic here, what's happening? And I've noticed something. So it's one of the reasons that I kind of write with chess notation in mind because it's a form of logic which I can see in the real world. So let's try something. Oh, there's a pattern. There's definitely a pattern. Sorry, it's this whole thing is like anybody that plays chess knows eventually you find patterns. Anybody that rolls jiu-jitsu knows eventually you find patterns. It's just I'm sure there are billions of other contexts in which patterns are a big thing. It all boils down to patterns. That's what mathematics and linguistics really are. It's just finding patterns that make sense to each other. And as I was saying about the whole like cultural superiority that does exist in the world, don't deny it. It's I'm not trying to. I feel very dangerously close to accidentally becoming a proponent of white supremacy when I say that. A lot of white, quote unquote, white cultures did it first. Like the French Empire and the British Empire, they did a lot of stuff first. They broke ground in ways that nobody else ever did before. And the same way, like a lot of Asian cultures, it's like you don't hear Asian superiority thrown around, even though like Japanese culture, the samurai and like the Chinese dynasties and all that were really, really dominant in their local areas. And frankly, if they decided to be more of a world conquering force, or I really need to check my history of this, maybe this. I mean, just look at Genghis Khan, the way he conquered so much of Asia and how purportedly, supposedly, we'll go with that word because I think I'm using purportedly correctly. I'll check it later. Supposedly, Genghis Khan is responsible for like a significant percentage of the world population, or it's Genghis Khan's hordes are responsible for. Like, who's to say that if it hadn't been for that specific portion of Asian history, if that hadn't happened, would all the stuff in Europe, would that have happened? Stuff like the Roman Empire, for example, or preceding that the Greeks, and like would those empires would have happened in the same way? And if the Roman Empire, if the Greeks hadn't happened, would the Romans have happened? If the Romans hadn't happened, would we have there's the Ottoman Empire? If we hadn't had the Ottoman Empire, would we have had